Welcome, everybody, to Design for Cognitive Bias Using Mental Shortcuts for Good Instead of Evil. I am David Dillon Thomas. I run David Dillon Thomas LLC, which is a company where I basically go around and get people excited about and give them better tools for more inclusive design. And I wrote this book, Design for Cognitive Bias. And the road to this book began with a podcast I used to do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. And the road to this podcast actually begins with this woman. Her name is Iris Bonnet, and she gave a talk once called Gender Equality by Design. It's a fantastic talk. Highly recommend you look it up on YouTube. And in it, she gets into this idea that a lot of implicit racial and gender bias can sometimes come back to pattern recognition. So imagine that you're hiring a web developer, and the image that might pop into your brain when I say the words web developer might be of a skinny white dude. And it is not because you think that men are better at programming than women, far from it, but the pattern that you may have seen in movies or television, or maybe even some offices you may have worked in, might establish that pattern. So if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit the pattern, all of a sudden you're starting to give that resume the side eye. Now, when I saw that something as terrible as racial or gender bias could sometimes come back to something as basic and, dare I say, as human as pattern recognition, I realized I need to figure out as much as I can about cognitive bias. And so that's what I did. This is the Rational Wiki page for cognitive biases. There are well over 100 here. And I looked at this and I realized I am not going to figure this out in a day. So I would literally look at one a day, and then the next day I'd move on to the next one. This turned me into the guy who would not shut up about cognitive bias. And eventually my friends were like, Dave, please just get a podcast. So let's start with the basics. What is cognitive bias? And at the end of the day, it's really just a series of shortcuts your mind is taking just to get through the day. We have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every single day. Even right now, I'm deciding how fast to talk, what to do with my hands, where to look. And if I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that a lot of our lives are spent on autopilot. But sometimes the autopilot gets it wrong. And we call those errors cognitive biases. So here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And it happens when you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a higher number, you tend to roll the die really hard. If you need a lower number, you tend to roll it gently. And we all know it makes absolutely no difference how hard you roll the die. But in situations where we have no control, we like to feel like we have control. And we embody that by how we roll the die. Now, this next one is not so fun. It's called confirmation bias. And it happens when you get an idea stuck in your head and you really only look for evidence to support the idea. And if you ever see evidence that doesn't support the idea, you yell fake news and you move on. So a really powerful example of this came during the lead up to the Iraq War. The whole idea was Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and we needed to go in there and get him before he gets us. It seemed very compelling. As it turns out, not so much with weapons of mass destruction. And within a year of the war starting, the president of the United States, who had insisted, yes, there were weapons of mass destruction there, said, yeah, we didn't find anything. Regardless, the number of people who believed there were weapons of mass destruction stayed very high, so high that even 14 years later, over 50% of Republicans and over 30% of Democrats were sure, yes, there were absolutely weapons of mass destruction there. So this is an extremely powerful bias. We will be coming back to it. Now, these biases are tough to fight. Part of the problem is you may not realize you even have the bias. There's literally a bias called the bias blind spot. And the way it works is you think you don't have any biases, but you're sure that everybody else does. Part of the problem is that about 95% of cognition is happening below the threshold of conscious thought. So you're making these decisions so quickly you don't even realize you've made them. So anytime anyone asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you are aware of the bias, you probably still do it anyway. There is a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could ask everybody on this call, write down the last 2 numbers of your phone number. And then I could say, okay, we're going to bid on this bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down higher numbers, probably going to bid higher. Those of you who wrote down lower numbers, probably going to bid lower. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. Now, here's the thing. I could tell you all of that before we do the experiment. You'd still do it. In fact, I could say, I will pay you cash money not to do it. You'd probably still do it. So the reason we need to care about cognitive bias is because of something called choice architecture. You can see it play out if you ever go buy produce, right? Common wisdom, if you go to a grocery store, is to pick from the bottom right of the section, because that's where the grocer is going to put the product they're most trying to get rid of, right? The oldest product, they'll put it at the top where it's easiest to reach. They have architected that situation to benefit themselves. Now, they could just as easily have architected it to benefit you by putting the freshest produce where it's easiest to reach. But either way they architect that experience affects the decisions you make in the experience. So think about the decisions your users need to make. And I'll think about how people make decisions, not how we think they make decisions, not how a rational human being makes decisions. No, how does somebody who's making 95% of their decisions without realizing it, how do they make decisions? And there are, in fact, content and design choices we can make that can help keep some of those biases at bay, or sometimes use them for good. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about tonight. So let's go back to that skinny white dude, right? As it turns out, in experiment after experiment, if you have two identical resumes, and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it is a female sounding name, it tends to stay in the pile. If it is a male sounding name, it tends to keep going through the process. But here's the thing. Why do you need to see that name? What about the name is helping you, the hiring manager, figure out who to hire? Think about it like a signal to noise ratio. The thing that you want to know, the signal, are things like the qualifications, the experience. That's helping you make the decision. What might be getting in the way of you making the decision are things like the gender or the race, or really what you're reading into the name based on the gender, or based on the in terms of gender and race. Now, as it turns out, the city of Philadelphia did a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position, and they discovered a couple things. One, the best way to anonymize a resume, even in the high-tech world of web development, is to have an intern with no stake in the process physically print it out, get a marker, and redact it like a CIA document. The next thing that they discovered is once they found a resume they liked, they would go to GitHub to look at that web developer's profile. And the second they went to look that up, the profile would load and all the personal information would be there and would ruin the experiment. So clever people that they wrote a little Chrome plugin that would anonymize that information, all their personal information, as soon as the page loaded. And then just to complete the circle, they took that code and they put it back on GitHub. It's there now if you ever want to try this yourself. Now, this isn't just about helping people make hiring decisions, right? So Amazon created this hiring bot that was meant to sift through thousands of resumes. And it turned out it was extremely sexist. So sexist that if it even saw the name of a woman's college on a resume, it would downgrade that resume. So when they opened up the black box and tried to figure out how did this AI get so sexist, they asked, well, how did we train it? Well, they trained it on the prior 10 years of resumes to Amazon, which seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do until you realize, what did most of those resumes have in common? It's mostly guys. So the AI took one look at that and said, gee, you sure must like dudes, and then just kept recommending dudes. Now, we like to think that AI is this all-knowing, objective, rational thing, when in fact it's basically a glorified prediction engine. And if you point it at a racist and sexist world, it will make racist, sexist predictions. Now, this can go in the other direction. Amazon Go is a store where you walk in, you take what you want, and you leave. And Amazon basically auto-magically deducts everything that you've taken from your account. Now, this had a curious effect for Ashley Clark Thompson, who wrote an article for CNET called "In Amazon Go, No One Thinks I'm Stealing." And what she's referring to is a phenomenon known as shopping while black. It manifests this kind of hyper-aggressive customer service. Can I help you? Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? There was no one in the store to do that to Ashley. So by removing one particular design element, namely the staff, Amazon actually created a less biased experience for this customer. Now, we're even seeing this play out in the judicial system. A while back, San Francisco tried out blind charging. So you should know that the district attorney in any city basically has tons of leeway in deciding whether or not to bring charges when a crime has been committed. And not surprisingly, if the accused is black, they tend to bring charges more frequently than if they're white, even for the same crime. So not unlike the resumes, they said, well, why do you even need that information when you're looking at the crime report? So they started producing crime reports for the DAs to look at that omitted the race and gender of the accused, the race and gender of the victim, and even the location of the crime. Another important term to think about here is cognitive fluency. And it's this basic idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's probably easy to do. But the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's probably hard to do. Now, I have been making a lot of pancakes for the past, say 3 years. And this is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of small, kind of clumped together. I might take a look at that and think, you know what? I bet pancakes are pretty hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. Now, I could take the same content, give it more full width imagery, more scannable bursts of text, and I might glance at that and think, you know what? I bet pancakes aren't that hard to make. Maybe I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're making pancakes. Now think about that same logic if I'm trying to decide whether or not to take public transportation. I take one look at that printed schedule and I think public transportation is impossible. I'm not going to do it. I take a look at that app screen and I think, oh, you know what? Maybe it's not that hard. Maybe I'll give it a try. Now, I can't see your faces right now, so I'm just going to ask you to vote in your hearts. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? Okay, how many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? Okay, you're both wrong. She was born in 1913, but people tend to pick 1914. Reason being, if something is easier to read, we actually think it's more true. But it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. Now, what's happening here is that we like things that are easier to process. Things that are easier to process feel more certain. And bias is all about certainty, right? It's all about finding ways to get to certainty because our minds love certainty and hate uncertainty. So if we need to throw logic under the bus to get to certainty, we'll do it. So things that are easier to process feel more certain. And I'll give you an example. If I asked you, hey, what did you get for your 5th birthday? You got a toy truck, right? You might not feel too certain about that answer, right? It's hard to process, hard to remember. It doesn't feel very certain. If I say, hey, what did you have for breakfast this morning? You might feel pretty certain about that answer. It's easy to remember, easy to process. It feels very certain. Things that rhyme are easier to remember. They're easier to process. They feel more certain. Things that have big, bold fonts and clear imagery and clear language are easier to process. They feel more certain. Now, this becomes important when we start to talk about things that people need to believe. There is a crisis in this country where African Americans, generally speaking, do not believe health information that comes from the government. In a 2002 survey, when given the statement the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, African American respondents, only 37% of African American respondents agreed with that statement. By 2016, that number had dropped to 18%. Now, we can do a whole other talk about why there are legit reasons that African Americans are distrustful of health information that comes from the government. But the fact remains, this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language and pictograms, so be it. Now, when I first put this in the book, my editor very wisely challenged me on this and said, okay, that's great in theory, but can you point to actual instances of clear language and pictograms and saving lives? And I'm glad she did, because it made me do the work and find these examples. So here we have women who are smoking while pregnant. And when they were given an intervention at the 3rd grade reading level, right, easier to process, they were more likely to stop smoking while pregnant and even 6 weeks postpartum. Here you have caregivers who are helping other people take their medication. And when they had a plain language pictogram-based intervention, you saw fewer medication dosing errors and improved adherence to actually taking the medication. Now you might say, okay, that's great for pictograms and plain language, but rhyming, really? Let's talk about click it or ticket. Back in the day, you had a whole bunch of different states roll out legislation that said, if you don't buckle your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. And the legislation on its own did a lot of good, especially with older drivers, but not as much with younger drivers. So they rolled out click it or ticket, and the results were that national belt use among young men and women from 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. Now, just to put that in more human terms, For every percentage point you go up and people actually buckling their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So doing the rough math, that's something like 4,000 lives saved, in part through rhyming. It is silly, but it works. Now, this whole easier to process thing even extends to name pronunciation, right? There's literally a name pronunciation effect where if your name is easier to pronounce, it can affect things like voting preferences, occupational status, with the caveat that easier to pronounce is a culturally specific thing, right? In some cultures, Smith is easier to pronounce. In some cultures, Mbimo is easier to pronounce. But if your name is easier to pronounce in the culture you're in, you got it made. They even looked at law firms, and the higher up you went in the ranks in the law firm, the easier the names got to pronounce. This even extends to stocks. If you have an IPO, something's about to go public, if the name of the company, the name of the stock is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. If even the little stock ticker abbreviation is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. So we will lay down real money on things that are easier to process. Now, the most dangerous bias in the world, for my money, is the framing effect. And it starts out innocently enough. Let's say you go into a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean. And next to it, you see a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which one do you think people are going to line up for? It's the same thing, but I framed one to seem a little more appealing. Now, that's all good and well when we're talking about beef, but what if I said, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? You see what I did there? Completely overlooking the idea of should we go to war in the first place, right? And wars have been started over less. Now, as it turns out, if you are bilingual, multilingual, you have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you can think about the decision in your non-primary language, you are less likely to fall for the scam. So I speak a little bit of French. So if I try to think about the beef decision in French, it would go something like, let's see, beef, that's boeuf, that's a lot of vowels. 95%, that's 89, no wait. And by the time I've done all that processing, right, I see right through the scam. And it's because I've had to slow down my thinking. Bias is something that happens when we're thinking really, really fast. If we can slow it down, we're less likely to fall for the scam. Highly recommend you read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's kind of a foundational work on all of this. Now, it turns out you can use the framing effect for good. There's an experiment where you show an audience a photo like this and you ask, should this person drive this car? And what you get is basically a policy debate, right? Some people say, oh, all people are bad at everything. Don't let them drive. And other people say, how dare you? That's ageist. Let people do what they want, right? All you learn by the end of that discussion is who's on what side. Now, you can take the exact same photo, show it to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what you'll get is basically a design discussion, right? Some people might say, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? What if we move the dashboard, right? And what you learn by the end of that discussion is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. I only changed 2 words, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I have changed the entire conversation. In fact, what if I zoom out a little more and I ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why she was in the car in the first place. She was here, but she wanted to be there. And if I frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. This even extends to academics, right? If you have students who are filling out a survey of their teachers, right? Student evaluations. This is yet another area where women and people of color are at a disadvantage and tend to be rated lower than their white male counterparts for the exact same coursework. So, our Iowa State University came up with this thing where they said, okay, let's send some of the students a couple paragraphs before they fill out the survey that basically say just that, right? This is a common area of injustice. Make sure that when you are filling this out, you are thinking about real criteria and not things like appearance. The students who got those paragraphs before they filled out the survey tended to rate their female professors higher than the ones who did not. Now, I want to close by talking about our biases, because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. Let's talk about notational bias. So notational bias, you can kind of think about in terms of music, right? So I grew up playing saxophone and I had to learn how to read music like this, standard Western sheet notation. And I came to think that, okay, any music in the world, you can write it down like this and then I can play it. As it turns out, that's not true at all. There are lots of African and Asian music for which this particular way of notation just doesn't work. And if this becomes the default, it's really easy to erase any number of and any amount of music. We might be more used to seeing this kind of erasure when we think about forms where we ask for personal information. So if I have it in my head that there's only 2 genders, and I make my forms that way, I can eradicate any number of identities. By the way, while we're talking about asking for personal information, you should know about the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias works like this. If something goes well, that's my fault. If something goes poorly, that's your fault. You may have encountered this bias in your professional careers at some point. This is true also with people and computers, right? If I'm doing something on a computer and something goes wrong, I'll blame the computer. If something goes right, I'll blame me. Unless I've given the computer a lot of personal information. The more personal information I give the computer, the more likely I am to blame myself if something goes wrong and the computer if something goes right. So we need to be very thoughtful just how often we ask for personal information, because the more we do it, the more we might be creating this unhealthy dynamic between people and their technology. Now, notational bias shows up all the time in structured content or editorial guidelines. This still gets me. Until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. So the way that would work is if it was the first mention of a woman's name in an article, you would say her full name. Every mention after that, you would either say Miss last name or Mrs. last name. Now think about the pattern, and remember how important patterns are. Think about the pattern that sets up, right? It basically says the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she's married, then maybe her last name. Think about that. In article after article for over 100 years, we need to be very careful how we structure content and how we set up editorial guidelines, because that is a very easy way to scale bias. Language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And this is legally true. Back in the day, you had Vice President Dick Cheney basically trying to figure out what he can get away with. So he talks to his lawyers and they say, okay, look, you are the vice president, therefore you are a part of the executive branch. But you also cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, so you're also part of the legislative branch. But wait a minute, you can't be a part of the executive branch and a part of the legislative branch. So maybe you're not a part of either. And if you're not a part of either, maybe you don't have to follow the rules of either. And he didn't. So we see the same thing today with software like Facebook, right? When it suits them, Facebook will position itself as a publisher. Hey, New York Times, come publish with us. We get you. When someone points out there are rules for publishers, it's all, I don't know what you heard, buddy. We're a platform. Now, there are tools out there to help us be more thoughtful about how we write for folks. There is Radical Copy Editor, which is great at helping you think about how to write for people that usually don't get a lot of say in how they're written about. Another one is Textio, which is really good for helping write more inclusive job descriptions, because not everyone, as it turns out, wants to be a ninja or a rock star. Another term we can think about is evidentiality, and it's this thing that English doesn't really have, but some other languages do. And it has to do with verb tense, right? So English basically uses verb tense to let you know when something happens, right? So there is Bob went to the store, Bob is going to the store, Bob will go to the store. Some languages like Turkish make their verb tense do a little more heavy lifting. So it's there to let you know how I know that Bob went to the store, right? So there's one verb tense for I myself personally saw Bob go to the store. There's another verb tense for somebody told me that Bob went to the store, and a whole other verb tense for, I don't know, I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. The point is, I can't tell you that Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know that Bob went to the store. Now, think about how that would affect what people were willing to post, what people were willing to say in a speech, if they literally couldn't say it without also saying how they knew it to be true. Now, English doesn't have this as a mandatory feature, but I think there are ways we can be creative about how to introduce it. Now, remember how I said that if something is easier to read, it feels more true? Well, the same is true in reverse. If something is harder to read, it feels a little less true. Now, this is an article that came out when the most recent Bond film's first trailer dropped. The first paragraph of the article basically has confirmable information, right? This is the name of the movie. This is who's in it. The second paragraph is a rumor about why the first director was fired. First paragraph, fairly easy to read, fairly easy to believe. Second paragraph, it's a little harder to read, and it should be harder to believe, and it should be because it's a rumor. So I think we can start to be a little creative about how we try to introduce to our users how many grains of salt they should be taking some of their content with. I told you we'd come back to this. So let me tell you a story about how I misinterpreted the scientific method. I used to think that the scientific method worked like this. I have an idea about how the world works, and I'm going to test that idea. And if I get a good result, I will write down what I did, and a whole bunch of other people will try the same thing I did. And if they get the same result, great, write it down. It's a law. Let's move on. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out it's a little more complicated. I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea, write down what I did. If I get a good result, a whole bunch of other people try the same thing. If they get the same result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Okay, let me go and try and prove that. Now, that is a much more rigorous approach, and it was created specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as designers, makers of things, content strategists, it is so easy for us to leave a good solution on the table because we fall in love with our first idea. Let me show you just how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game with the computer, and the computer is going to show us these numbers and that question mark and say, put whatever number you like where the question mark is, and I'll tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you're ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. If you're like me, the first number you try is 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that number fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, say, nah, I got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And the reason it says no is because I never tried this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is simply every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution, probably easier to code, probably cheaper to build, but I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are tools out there to help us avoid that outcome. One of them is called red team, blue team. And the way it works is you have a blue team who does the initial research, maybe gets as far as a wireframe, but before they go any further, the red team comes in for one day. And the red team's job is to go to war with the blue team. They're there to find every hidden assumption, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team missed because they were so in love with their first idea. Now, one of the things I like about this approach is that it's fairly cost effective, right? I don't have to go to my boss and say, hey, we got to hire 2 teams now for every single project and they got to check each other's work every single day. No, I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely that I'm going to put something harmful out into the world. Another thing I like about this approach is that it highlights the value of outside perspective. This is Norman Ohler. He wrote a book called Blitzed about Nazis on drugs. And the way it came about is he had a German DJ friend who said, hey, when I was a kid growing up in Munich, all the World War II vets would talk about how they were high all the time. Norman took his DJ friend at his word and did the research, and sure enough, the Nazis kept meticulous records. Here's what they were giving the soldiers, basically meth. Here's what they were giving Hitler, basically oxy. And oh, by the way, here's what they were giving the German populace at the time. Now, World War II is not an understudied conflict, and yet somehow this got missed. Why? My pet theory is that the Venn diagram of historians and people who have experience with recreational drug use isn't very big. And if our German DJ friend had gone to your average historian and said, hey, did you know the Nazis were on drugs? A lot of them would have said, okay, whatever, junkie. But Norman, also familiar with recreational drug use, took his friend at his word. Point is, if you were saying, hey, Dave, we're going to write a book about World War II, who should we talk to? My first answer would not be a German DJ, but it would be a great answer. Now, part of the problem we have with designing a way that doesn't cause harm is we don't like to think about the unhappy path, right? And part of it has to do with how we sell design and content strategy. No one says, hey, I'm going to redo your website and here's all the problems you're going to have. No, we say, we're going to redesign your website and here's how much easier it's going to be to find things. And you're going to sell so much more product, blah, blah, blah. But for any new feature we create that could go right, there's at least 5 things that could go wrong. So we should spend at least as much time designing for that. Now, part of the problem we have thinking about that is something called the survivorship bias. And a good illustration of it is a true story of this guy named Abraham Wald. He was a brilliant Austrian mathematician living in Austria in the 1930s. Unfortunately, he was also a Jewish mathematician living in Austria in the 1930s, and his life was in danger. He managed to get out before the Nazis moved in, and he came to the States. Here, he was asked to help out with the war effort, and specifically, they wanted to know, hey, we've got all these planes that keep getting shot down. How can we arm these planes in a way that makes it less likely to be shot down? Where should we put more armor on these planes? So they put him in a hangar with a bunch of other scientists and a bunch of planes with bullet holes in them. And most of the scientists say, okay, this isn't rocket science. You just, where you see the bullet holes, put more armor there. Abraham says, no, that's actually not where you put. You want to put the armor in the opposite place. You want to put it where you don't see bullet holes. Why? Because Abraham realized they were looking at the planes that were shot up, but not shot up so bad that they couldn't make it back. They needed to worry about the planes that were shot up so bad that they never made it back. And those planes clearly were shot where these planes were not. They were thinking about the survivors. They weren't thinking about the ones that weren't so lucky. Now, one of the tools we can use to help us think about that unhappy path is called speculative design. And it's a lot like the show Black Mirror, which if you've never seen it, it's basically a twilight zone for tech. You take some near future technology and you tell a story about what would happen if real human beings got their hands on it. And the result is always terrible. This is by the way, I think anybody working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode about it first. But this is actually a real job. The folks at Superflex went down to the United Arab Emirates to help them figure out the future of energy. And the question on the table was, should we continue on the road of fossil fuels, or should we start investing in renewables? So one of the things that Superflex did was to say, okay, let's figure out what your air quality is going to be like if you stay on the road of fossil fuels 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out. But they didn't just figure it out. They bottled it, and then they made them breathe it. And by the time you get to 10 years out, it is unbreathable. By the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they were going to invest over $150 billion in renewables. Another thing you can do to kind of get all your biases out on the table at the beginning of a project, it's called an assumption audit. Basically, you get your whole team in a room before you kick off, and you ask 5 questions. 1, what identities does your team represent, right? And you're only going to self-identify as you feel comfortable, but the types of things you're thinking about are gender or age or income, neurodiversity. The next thing you ask is, how might those identities influence the design of this thing we're working on? Then you ask, well, who's not in the room, right? Anybody here ever been incarcerated? Anybody here ever had their immigration status questioned? Then you ask, well, how might the lack of perspective compromise the design of this thing we're working on? And finally, you ask, what might we do to include, honor, and give power to those voices in the design process? And I choose those words carefully. Include, yes, certainly talk to people. Honor, maybe pay them for their time. Give power. Are there people who are going to be affected by this design, who have no say in this design? And how do we give them more say? Because guess what? They have to live with what we make. A great example of this comes from a tweet about the show Mandalorian, which if you haven't seen, it's this Star Wars show takes place in a faraway galaxy, a planet with these aliens that speak mostly through sign language. And one of the people working on it was like, well, hey, I know someone who actually is a deaf actor and like could help us develop this language. And they brought them in and actually helped make it this really authentic feeling language that those aliens had. My favorite part of the tweet is this line: it's our responsibility when we're in the room to look around and see who's missing. Now, one of the things you can do to really kind of figure out who you want in the room is an approach called participatory design. Participatory design looks very much like the regular design process, except you're being very attentive to how power plays out in the design process. So one of the first things you do if you're taking this approach is create something called a power map. This is a power map. And you can see the x-axis is really thinking about interest, right? Who is interested, who's actually impacted by this work, and as a result is interested in it, right? So low interest, who doesn't really care. High interest, oh, you're really going to be impacted by this. You're really interested in the outcome. The other axis is power. Who has very little say in how this project turns out, and who has all the say? Now, as an example, I want you to consider work that the Philadelphia government did with the Office of Homeless Services. They were redoing the intake process for people experiencing homelessness. Now, the people who are going to be really impacted by that work, but who have no say in the outcome, are the people experiencing homelessness, right? And maybe a little bit up from that, the people providing the services. So the whole project of participatory design going forward is how do we take those people in that lower right who are really impacted but have no power and move them up into the upper right where they are very impacted, but they also have a lot of say. And a lot of that just comes down to accountability, right? I'm not just going to go interview a bunch of people experiencing homelessness and say, okay, thank you for your time. I'm never going to see you again. No, I'm going to synthesize that research. I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask, hey, did we get this right? And if we didn't, we're not done yet. The design process, right? I'm not going to design at them. I'm going to design with them. And again, before the design is final, did we get this right? If not, we're not done yet. Finally, before we implement anything, you guessed it, did we get this right? If not, it's not ready to implement. And again, we're doing this because they have to live with what we build. Now, a really great example of this came out of Montana State University, where they have a fairly large indigenous population at the school, and they had a library, and the indigenous folks at the school, the students were not using it. And they're like, okay, well, what do we do about this? And they decided to take a participatory approach to solving that problem. And they invited some of the indigenous students to help them figure it out, right? Not as research subjects, but as actual participants in the design. And one of the things they found out, by the way, right out of the gate, they were thinking, oh, we need to build an app because everyone thinks you need to build an app. The students, the indigenous students told them, no, you need posters. You need posters and they need to go here, here, and here. And what you're seeing here is some of the designs that led to, and then the poster designs themselves. And what I love about this, the quote that inspired the folks who worked on this comes from Eve Tux, and it says, how do we build a university that deserves indigenous people? I love that approach because it's not this sort of like white savior, hey, you poor people, I'm going to come in and help you. It's like, no, we need to make something that is deserving of you, right? You are actually in a position of honor. We need to make things that are actually worthy of your involvement. I love that sentiment. The last bias I want to talk about is called the déformation professionnelle, which I speak French. It is a bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job, which in the workaholic world a lot of us inhabit might seem like a good idea, right up until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road that night probably thought they were doing a great job. Technically speaking, kind of were, right? They were getting really difficult to get photographs that were going to fetch them a really high price. What they were not doing a good job of is being human beings. Now, the former police commissioner of Philadelphia, a guy named Ramsey, when he took the job, he asked all of his officers the same question. What do you think your job is? Many of them would answer to enforce the law. And he would say, okay, that seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I told you your job is to protect civil rights? Now, that encompasses enforcing the law, but it's a much harder job because it forces you to treat people with dignity. Now, I have had this slide in here for a while, and it is always difficult to get through, but I keep it in here because now more than ever, it's clear how we define our jobs is a matter of life and death. Ramsey was telling his officers that day, your jobs are harder than you think. And I'm here to tell us, our jobs are harder than we think. It can't just be design cool shit. Now, we need to find a way to define our jobs that allows us to be more human to each other. And there are people who are working on this, right? Mike Montero out at Mule Design is a design ethics booklet that's basically a Hippocratic oath for designers of first do no harm. There's the Design Justice Network, which does fantastic work in this area. They have nodes all over the world. See if there's one in your city. They have these 10 principles. I'm just going to read you the first 2. We use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. 2, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. Now, if you just try to stick to those first 2, you've got your work cut out for you. It's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. Often we think we're doing the former when in fact we're kind of doing the latter. Now, what gives me hope, honestly, in this work is that we don't have to start from scratch. We already have ways to think about these problems. The study of moral philosophy and ethics is literally thousands of years old. And places like the Mercola Center for Applied Ethics does a great job of taking all that wisdom and distilling it into key questions you can ask about your work. Which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? That's the utilitarian approach. Which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be? That's the virtue approach, right? Very old wisdom. It's just we need to actually start making it a part of our process. Another great tool for this is the Tarot Cards of Tech. And it's basically this website you go to, and there are these cards, and you click on them, and they flip over and give you these really provocative questions about your work. How might cultural habits change how your product is used, and how might your product change cultural habits? If Twitter had asked itself this before it launched, or even today, frankly, we might be living in a very different world. This is even showing up in software engineering, right? So there's the Never Again Pledge, which a bunch of software engineers and data scientists got together and signed when they saw that their work with data was being used to hurt immigrants. And they pointed to a very long and sordid history of data being used to hurt excluded populations and said, we don't want to be a part of that history. And here's a list of things we're willing to do to make sure that never happens, up to and including destroying unethical data sets. We're even seeing this kind of collective action play out at places like Google, where there was Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI, and the people working on it, when they realized what it was, they said, look, we didn't get into this business to build weapons. If you make us work on this, we're going to walk. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million project with the military. And then they turned around and did Dragonfly, which is a censored search in China product. So this battle is ongoing. Now, if you do kind of want to take up this mantle and kind of fight this fight, it's important that you know about consistency bias. So the way it works is, if I come up to you and I say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're probably going to say no. But if I say, hey, can I put this tiny little, you're not even going to notice it, it's just this little, you're more likely to say yes. If you say yes, and I come back 2 weeks later and I say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're actually more likely to say yes, because you're sign people now. We like to make decisions that are consistent with our former decisions. So if I want to, launch inclusive design at my company, I could say, hey, we're going to form the inclusive design committee, and we're going to meet on Mondays, and we're going to overhaul the entire design, way we do design from soup to nuts. Okay, that is going to be a meeting engine. Or I could say, hey, boss, on this next project, can we do an assumption audit? It's like a 2-hour meeting. This is like a 300-hour project. Can I just get 2 hours for this? More likely to say yes. If they say yes, and I come back a few projects later and I say, hey, this assumption audit thing has been going great. Can we do a red team on this next project? It takes a whole day, but this is like a 100-day project. And it's more likely to say yes, because I guess we're inclusive design people now. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this is not some software guru giving a TED Talk. It's Martin Luther King. Over 50 years ago, we saw this to be true, and it is only more true today. So the question I will leave us with is, how can we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Wow, thank you, David. That was incredible.
Thanks.
I think we're all kind of like, oh my gosh, so much to think about here, and so many books to go read and things to look up.
Yeah, and I will send you that you can then send to all the attendees a resource sheet, a link to a resource sheet of like all the stuff I talked about. So
yes, that's great. Thank you.
Sure.
We do have a few questions here, and anyone else, as I'm asking these, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. But the first one came from Samuel McCune, asking, could you provide an everyday example of survivorship bias?
Okay. Well, that's a good question. So I think when we do, UX research, right? And we think about things like, actually, I'll give you a great example. And this is sort of common knowledge, but if you ever do any kind of UX research where you're trying to do something like a service website or a call center kind of like website, a help section, right? The sort of dreaded IA nightmare that is a help section website. We tend to think about like two things, right? Completion, I actually did the task or whatever. And we kind of compare to like complaints, basically. How many complaints do we get? And what we don't think about is all the attempts to complete or the people never even trying to complete because they took one look at that page and were like, oh, no, hell no, right? Right, that doesn't get captured in any meaningful way. And so we assume it doesn't exist, where most experienced UX professionals will say, okay, if you've got one people complaining about something on that website, that represents at least 10, probably more like 100 people who were pissed off but didn't bother to complain, right? So that's an example of we're focusing basically on what we can see or what gets completed, and we're not thinking about the stuff that we never even get the chance to know failed. That's sort of one example that's a little more common to our field of what I think survivorship bias looks like.
Right. Rebecca Blakiston asks, I love the idea of an assumption audit. Any other suggestions on activities to run as a team to discover our own biases and mitigate them?
I mean, that's a really good one. I find that those two ones I think are really good. I think that those kind of undergird the other exercises I can think of are sort of like the next level after that, and that have a lot more to do with goal setting and really understanding the why in your work and making sure that you're including as many people who are going to be impacted by the work in that decision. So basically, before you do anything else, I want you doing that assumption audit. I want you including red team, blue team throughout. But there are things that like what's called an objective matrix, where you're really mapping out the why of your work and saying, okay, what's the actual goal of this work? Okay, well, how do you think you're going to achieve that goal? That becomes the objectives column. And then, no, really, how are you going to do that? That becomes a strategy column. And then, okay, well, what specific things are you going to do to make sure that happens? Becomes a tactics column. And then here's the key. How are we going to measure if those tactics are working, right? And what you put in that measurement column is really important. And if it doesn't match what's in that objective column, you are going to run into trouble. Right. So simple example is I have a marketing website and we decide that one of our tactics, one of our objectives is to increase sales leads. And one of the strategies for that is going to be, oh, we're going to make more content. And the specific tactic is we're going to do case studies. If the measurement of whether or not case studies is working is number of case studies, we're going to have a problem, right? Because that tells me nothing about what leads got generated, because that's what we actually wanted to do, was generate leads. So it's an easy bias trap to fall into, but whatever's in that measurement column should match what's in the objectives column, which was increased sales leads. So increased sales leads is actually how I should be measuring the success of the case study, right? Strategy. So all of which to say, those kinds of activities, which are great to be done as a group, I think those are other activities that can help, but they're not as helpful if you haven't first done like the assumption audit and the red team, blue team type of things.
Right. Bridget asks, how do you invite underrepresented folks to collaborate / give input without tokenizing people?
Yes, and that is the domain of experts who are not me, because that is its own specific discipline. You will find people who do social work who are very smart, and community activists are very, very skilled in this, because that's literally what they do, is find ways to get people who don't usually get asked to be involved. I can tell you a couple of broad themes. One is understand what compensation looks like from the perspective of the person you're compensating, right? So I was talking to someone who does reentry, and they were saying for a lot of these folks, just saying, hey, here's some cash to do a thing isn't necessarily all that helpful, because they literally don't have bank accounts, right? He was telling me for some of them, a Starbucks card is actually awesome, right? Which is not something you know or think of offhand, but that's actually much more useful because, again, like my money's in underneath my bed right now because I don't have a bank account, because I can't get a bank account because I'm just got out of prison. So understanding that from the perspective of the person you are asking for help, what is meaningful compensation for that in their world is very important. And honestly, the main thing I would say is make sure that whatever you're setting up isn't just a matter of, hey, I want your input, now go away. It is a matter of you are actually going to decide how this turns out. The more you can actually truthfully say that, which means, by the way, getting the buy-in of the CEO, right? Because they're paying the bills. But if you can actually say, hey, this isn't going to launch until it looks the way you want it to, that is meaningful involvement, right? because now I actually have, like, the whole experience of being underserved is the experience of not having power, of not having agency. Saying, no, you actually get agency, and demonstrating that, by the way, right? You've got to get that buy-in early. You get, like, very early, show that you mean what you say, and have that happen. I think that's the other critical thing we miss when we do a lot of this work. I'm reading a book about nonprofits right now called Systems Change. Systems thinking for social change. And the consistent theme is, if you want the stuff to actually work, you can't just do a top down, hey, poor people, here's a list of things you need to do if you want to be rich, right? No, you have to push that power to the edges and say, no, you figure out, right? And we will empower you, like whatever suggestions you make, we'll do that. But you actually have to have the agency in the situation. So I would say the key thing for getting that buy-in and trust and not tokenizing is actually giving power. Because tokens don't have power. Tokens are just there to be in the display window.
To follow up on that a little bit, David, I wonder if, have you seen good examples of going back and, user testing or bringing those, the people kind of back in at any point, or maybe even along the way as something is being developed for any kind of milestone checks or ways to make sure that you're following up with them at the end of the process, as well as kind of the bringing people in and getting buy-in to begin with.
So yeah, the example I showed you from Montana State University, and